Welcome to Amy's Bookshelf Reviews podcast. It is a spin-off of the website and book review site of Amy's Bookshelf Reviews. Amy's Bookshelf Reviews podcast is about book reviews, a writer's muse, a book's peruse, author interviews, and literary news. Welcome to the new year, where new things may happen with this. I hope you all enjoy, and thank you for listening.
Good evening, listeners. I'm Amy, and welcome to Amy's Bookshelf Reviews podcast. Today I have authors Brian and Cameron Santana. So why don't you please introduce yourself and let the audience know how they can connect with you.
Hi, my name is Brian Santana, and I'm a university professor and author, and your listeners can connect with me on X, and if they search for Brian Santana, it'll pop up as one of the verified accounts.
Great. Cameron?
Hi, I'm Cameron Santana. I'm the cop in the book, and you can connect with me on X at Santana Brothers True Crime, and also on Instagram at Santana Brothers True Crime.
Great. So, I just, let's remind, why don't you tell the audience what book that you're promoting and how you started putting it together, the two of you.
So this is the book is called A Murder on Campus: The Professor, the Cop, and North Carolina's Most Notorious Cold Case. And the project originated with me while I was a student at the University of North Carolina, Asheville. I was an undergraduate drama major in 1999, and this book really started because my first day in college, what's most memorable about to me now was that it was also the first day I learned about the murder of another drama student named Virginia Olsen. And so this was, I found myself in the main theater of Carol Belk at UNC Asheville, which is where their plays were performed before a class. And I was standing there looking at a picture that was about 4 feet tall. It's the image that's on the cover of the book, if your listeners pick up the book. And a student came up to me and said, that's Virginia Olsen. She died here a long time ago. Later during the year, someone else said, well, that's Virginia Olsen was actually murdered, and she was murdered in the theater. Someone later told me, no, that's not right. She was actually murdered and raped, and it was in the gardens adjacent to the theater. Really, there wasn't a really straight story. And so it was one of those that I became really interested in from kind of day one. And it's been a kind of big interest of mine to the present day, obviously. And Cameron came into this in the last few years when I was working on a true crime class. And I was asked exactly, what's a case that you really care about? And my students did. And I'd written about some other things. And this was a case that I'd always wanted to do something more with, but I'd never been able to fully pull the trigger and kind of commit to a project. And that's kind of where Cameron came into this.
Yeah, so I was transitioning out of being a full-time law enforcement officer, and I was working part-time and also taking care of my special needs daughter. And I really was trying to find something in my life that gave me that fulfillment of being a real street cop. And Brian had been telling me about these cases that they were working on in class. And then finally, he gave me a phone call about the Virginia Olsen case and told me that a lot of things just had not been written on the case. And he gave me some background on it and asked me if I would help him write an article and maybe it would turn into a book. And so I really played it off and really didn't put too much into it. I just told him, sure, whatever. And 2 days later, he called me back and told me that we were under contract and we need to get to work on this book. So fast forward a couple years and here we are.
Wow, that's pretty amazing. I'm sure I find it interesting how books can be written by more than one author. Mm-hmm. And one thing I did notice, and then I liked as I was reading the book, and then you would break down like, okay, this is my perspective, Brian would write his perspective as the professor, you would write your perspective as the cop. And I find that was really interesting. When you were collaborating on the other pieces of the book, how was that? Were you able to both communicate? Did you have certain tasks that you had to do? Like you were going to do this type of investigation while Brian did something else? Or how did that really work?
I think early on, I think it worked in very similar ways, both with the writing and with the research. With research, it was much more, and when we were gathering information, I think it was much more kind of task driven, where it might be, okay, so Cameron was the one who was able to get the search warrant, and he's focusing his energy on that. While he was working on the search warrant, I was simultaneously kind of working to get a hold of the medical examiner's report. So that's kind of during the research stage. So we would have those things. So we had these really daily phone calls. Our days would typically start first thing in the morning, and I would give him a very early when I got up before I was getting ready for school, and we would talk about like, okay, so like, what are you working on today? What am I working on? And then we would kind of do that. However, we were able to kind of get that done during the course of the day. We would touch base in the evenings again, and when we were researching, kind of discuss what we had found. We would exchange papers, what we had found, and talk about what we thought it all meant. And when we started drafting, after the research was largely done, or at least we're still working on it right now, really, as new developments come up, as the book has gotten some attention. But in terms of the actual book that you have, we would really start, particularly at least with the first half of the book, where there's a more unified voice. He would work on an area, or I would. We would exchange papers. I would send him, okay, so these are a few pages I wrote. He'd send me one I wrote. He would write notes on the things that I sent him. I would write some notes and ideas on stuff that he sent me, and we would just kind of go back and forth like that. And then, of course, when our editors at the publisher got involved, it was very similar. They would circulate notes to us, and we would kind of talk about what they meant and kind of do that and send it back to them, and kind of vice versa.
Pretty interesting. No, really. Do you think I'm not sure about what your relationship, how close you were as brothers prior to collaborating on this book, but do you think it brought you closer? Maybe you understood each other more, or were you always close and you were just able to be in sync with what you guys were doing?
I think we've always been close, but we're separated by he's in West Virginia and I'm in North Carolina, and we both have small children, and so life really gets busy a lot of times. But with this, it was constant texting and phone calls to the point of annoying our wives. Because, when you're working remotely like that, I would find something interesting, immediately send it to him, and vice versa. And so it was, and it still is. We still talk multiple times a day because, like Brian says, we're not stopping at this. We're continuing to dig as much as we can, and we're still advocating for this case to get attention and for people to come forward. So that, we've been close, but this has made us even closer.
Yeah, I had a similar experience. I think one of the things that I came to appreciate in a different way, I knew Cameron was a police officer. I'd even done a ride along with him once, a long time ago. And so I had some sense of what he did for his work. But until we started working on this, and he was looking for, one of the things he does in the book is, that I thought was really smart, was that he would take, so some of the officers that are investigating the case, at least the first ones on the scene in this murder, are very inexperienced. So Cameron would dig into kind of some of his own experiences and thinking about that first murder scene that he ever attended as a young rookie police officer, what that felt like, what it looked like, and use that not necessarily as the perfect barometer, but as one way to offer the reader some insights into what types of thing might have been going through a young kind of inexperienced officer's mind. they arrived at a really gruesome scene, like the one we have in this book. And so, one of the things that was really kind of interesting to me was I heard a lot of stories about his experiences as a police officer that I had never heard before. I was just telling him just this again the other day. I feel like whenever we do some of the podcast and shows and I hear other stories, like I'm still learning a lot about this period of his life that was pretty big when he was active with the Raleigh Police Department. So there was that, and then the other thing was it made in some ways the communication very easy because we don't really have any kind of qualms about being very kind of open about how we're thinking about anything that we're that's going on with this case, and so we can talk very kind of openly in that way.
Well, no, that's great. I mean, one of the questions that I was going to ask, but I think that you said you're digging, you're still digging deeper. Do you think that like true crime books, basically in general, if they're about unsolved case, could lead to the case being solved?
I think that they can. I think that as technology evolves, especially when we're looking at DNA, if it's a somewhat modern case and the evidence is stored properly, then I think that one of the things that we talk about is, and Chief Anarina, who is one of the Asheville chiefs that's largely a part of this case,
right.
One of the things that he kind of comments on is that the public's involvement in the case is very important. And if the public gets behind it, then that's going to allow them to use more resources. And I think that that's something that applies today is that you've got a lot of private labs that are working with DNA, and it's continuing to evolve. And, that's not free. And I think that as technology evolves and they continue to improve, maybe that will bring in some hope to have additional tests that will resolve these cases. But the other thing about true crime books in general, I believe that's important, is just to make sure these victims aren't forgotten. This was a 19-year-old college student that had, a great life ahead of her. She was studying hard and she was brutally raped and murdered.
Yeah.
And I think that if you ask people in North Carolina or even Asheville who Virginia Olsen is, they wouldn't be able to tell you. And I'm sure that applies to a lot of students, even at UNC Asheville. So one of our goals is to make sure that her name is not forgotten and that people, especially in North Carolina, will know her name.
Yeah. No,
Yeah.
you understand. I've read, I've always been a fan of true crime. When it was mentioned about unsolved mysteries, I was like, oh, yes, that was me too.
Yeah.
And that's the thing. I think those shows like that, those like Unsolved Mysteries, those shows, even like a lot of people, those get wide exposure. And I think that one of the challenges with this case was just that it was it occurred the same week that Watergate hearings started, and so there's like that happening on a national scale. On a local scale, back home where Virginia Olsen was from in Northern Virginia, two kids that same week, from her high school were killed in a tragic car accident. So you have this curious set of circumstances where you have national coverage is being dominated by things like Watergate and kind of political scandal. And then you have back home where she was from, she had been away from that area for a year and a half. And so there's not a lot of significant coverage that's happening in her hometown. But in North Carolina, she's mostly associated with UNC Asheville. Her parents were living in Lexington, North Carolina, which is a few hours away. And she had not firmly established herself completely in North Carolina. And so a lot of her friend group was still based in Northern Virginia. And we're still in touch with a lot of those people to this day. And so we have this circumstance in which she's not really a longtime North Carolinian. Her parents moved there right after her high school graduation, but she's starting college that same 2.5 months later,
right,
after they move. And so she really just becomes affiliated with just the university. And so this case doesn't really get a lot of attention outside North Carolina. There's a significant amount of attention during the first 2 years, but after that, it really starts kind of falling away. And so, because of that, particularly when the university or the Asheville Police Department do not do significant work in publicly talking about the case, it really just makes it easy for it to slide away. But when you see the impact that this murder had, it's a kind of ripple effect. And having many interactions with people who knew and cared about her, and how this completely transformed the trajectory of their lives, I think makes you feel especially motivated to make sure that people just know that her life mattered, and that this thing did happen, and that it can become almost like a personal thing when you see people like deliberately kind of misconstruing something or trying to sweep it under the rug or making an effort not to talk about it, because you really do feel, like Cameron said, that you're kind of you take on the burden, because other people aren't as familiar with this case, of a kind of advocate's role of making sure that people are forced to say her name, and that we're forced to kind of talk about kind of what happened.
Yeah, that was one of the things that I really appreciated. I don't know if appreciate is the word, but there are times when I've read true crime books, and it was less about the victim, but more about the crime and the person or persons who had committed the crime. And I always the thing I look for is, knowing who the victims were, and how much, and no matter what their status in life was, every life is important. So, and if someone loses that, then they can, I think it's great for people to be reminded. And I do know, recently, not too long ago, there was the Long Island killer was caught, and I remember watching the true crime show about it before they had resolved or solved that case. So, I just I always thought, am I morbid because I like the true crime, and I'm very interested in, about like profiling, and that kind of stuff just interests me. And when I had the chance to interview the two of you, I was like, this is just, what I wanted to do. You're my first true crime authors that I've been able to speak to. So I am really thankful that you are here. And I really enjoyed reading the book and getting the information. And I loved about the photographs in the back of the book, and also that they posted them on the Wild Blue Press website. Focus on her, and even I saw the quick book trailer that they did, talking about Virginia, and I think that it was. I think Virginia would be honored that she's being honored and not forgotten, because too many times they don't hear about something anymore, and they just move on to the next tragedy. So I want to thank you personally for bringing this, to public knowledge. I know you guys are doing different podcasts and just putting out the book, and yet you're still working on leads and information. And I hope that someday this case can be solved and Virginia can really have that peace.
Well, I think that some of this is where you mentioned the kind of that kind of morbid feeling of reading true crime, or these questions you ask about your own kind of morbid interest. I hear that from my students all the time as well sometimes. And what I try to impress, and this is maybe for your listeners as well, I tend to think about true crime is a genre that is very life affirming in some ways versus being just something. A lot of the circumstances that are described are very kind of messy and ugly, but the very basis of true crime is that people who are standing outside of these investigations, if it's like an investigatory true crime like ours is, and by looking really closely and bringing new eyes and bringing new types of perspectives and information into it, that these cases that are cold, that seem insurmountable, that we can understand them better, tomorrow than we do today, and that eventually there's always that possibility that new answers or even resolution can be found. And so I think if you kind of imagine it in that way, then it's not really reveling in the status quo of something happened past tense, but something that's still evolving and finding new ways to understand and think about it, whether it's a victim or whether it's the actual kind of crime or investigation. But we're making some kind of progress by looking at it really carefully. And to me, that's very kind of life affirming. That's not something that it is kind of paralyzing and ugly and just bad things happen and there's not really much we can do about it except for record them. Right. But it's about kind of trying to give some meaning and sense to things that seem brutal and senseless.
Yeah. No, I like that because, when I'm whether I'm watching a true crime show or listening to a true crime podcast or reading one of the true crime books, and I always it's like, I always look for, it feels like it's like pieces of this puzzle that are slowly coming together as, I love the investigative part of it, not necessarily, course, the crime, especially ones like this, that it's just, you can't even really imagine what the victim was going through prior to being killed. Those moments that she was, the last few moments of her life, but, you respect the victim. You investigate the crime and you use whatever tools you have available. Like you said, what we have today, we might have something better tomorrow. I like when I watch a regular, like a TV show or something, I like that aha moment where you find something that you didn't even realize that you were looking for, but it's like there, and it's like, how do you come across and realize, oh, this is something very important rather than something that, it's just a piece of trash that has nothing to do with a crime or something like that. But, where you can find something, even something simple, and it, is a big deal, a big clue in the investigative process.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and that's what I think is so interesting and intoxicating about this book that we have is it's not one of those books that you're going to read from start to finish and go, aha, I know who did it.
Right.
You're going to probably read it the first time and have an opinion. And I bet that if you looked back through that book and start going down rabbit holes, you're going to probably even start changing your opinion or your view on things. That's something that happened with me and Brian throughout this entire process, where we thought, oh, if we just get the search warrant, then we'll have it solved. And then we got the search warrant and we were super happy with the details that provided. And then we started researching it some more and we're like, well, wait a minute, there's these other suspects too. And then Brian talked with an FBI profiler and she had a completely different opinion than us. And so I think that that's what's fun about true crime is not just reading it from start to finish, but like really having to think and like chew on those questions.
Yeah, and I must admit that I've actually read it 3 times already. So And I went back through some of my notes and went back through it again to prepare for this one, to just kind of keep it, fresh in my mind. And I just really think that, and hope that this will lead to something more, more information. Was there ever a point when you were doing your research that you realized, oh, I have to, like there's some research or information you had gotten, but then you realized that you needed to, I don't know, like stop at a certain point because you can go down that rabbit hole when you're doing research, whether it's for true crime or any other type of genre where you're doing research. Sometimes you got to say, okay, I got to take a step back, and this is what I know. This is the facts, and there's stuff that you found, but it really just ended up not being like relevant to what you were, Virginia story that you were telling, or some of the other victims from other crimes that were either associated or not associated.
Yeah, there was a lot of there were a lot of things that developed, particularly about just some of the people that pop up in our book. There were a lot of details that weren't immediately relevant, especially when we were talking about like the historical investigation, like into Olson's case,
right.
that were kind of they were not fully developed in the actual book. And then yeah, to your question, I do think that you can go down these rabbit holes potentially forever. Like after we had the full manuscript in, there'd be these different kinds of like leads or things that were kind of dropped in that didn't really lead us to they weren't leading us to an endpoint. So it's not like there's some big revelation at this moment as I'm talking to you that we have that's substantially different from the book. But there would be these little details that just gave you slightly different ways to think about people or kind of events that pop up in our book that we were not aware of then. And I do think at a certain point in time, you recognize that, a story is something with a beginning, middle, and end, though not necessarily in that order, and a point attached to it. Yep. And the end in this particular story was not obvious. So it wasn't that we were the kind of end was that every question was leading to even more questions. And so at least one way to contain that was to consider the second half of the book where we were looking at different theories. We looked at theories that were inspired by theories that the police actually looked at originally, and we kind of did our own kind of look at them, like the Sue Ellen Evans case we looked at. There was an effort in 1977 to explore possible connections that the FBI did between different unsolved murders. So we took some of those types of cases that were part of that, and we kind of look at those ourselves. But then we also took some community rumors, things that have been floating around Asheville for a while, and said, look, this is a case that's been widely misunderstood. Let's take some of these major rumors and try to understand where they came from, and in some cases debunk them. And then also working to kind of develop our own theory based on what can actually be known about that original investigation, and at the moment we were writing, what we thought was the kind of likely what likely happened, but also kind of leaving room that here's questions that we are still trying to figure out and answer, with a hope that we are inviting readers who read this book to potentially either come forward with new information that they have, or to engage and give us different ways to think about it. We are very open to that. I just had a conversation with someone this morning that was kind of giving me new ways to think about some potentially kind of new information surrounding this case. And so yeah, it's an evolving kind of discussion, but unlike in a traditional, let's say, kind of history, if I'm working on like for the 19th century, which is like my background, like I know what the endpoint is. I'm standing over 150 years removed from that. So there is that clear kind of endpoint that story is going to have. This one is evolving. And so just being okay with the fact that questions are going to lead to more questions, and we don't have to have that definite ending to it. And in fact, those questions are kind of what's going to make it interesting.
Yeah, I understand that. So Cameron, do you think that because of your background as a police officer, that it helped you gain information that maybe Brian wouldn't have been able to get himself?
It's actually a really funny question. So I really thought that the first thing that I'd be able to do is get in touch with someone at the Asheville Police Department that would give me kind of the behind the scenes look at the case, things that you normally wouldn't share with someone from the media. And I started to make phone calls. And the really interesting thing is that one of the guys I was talking with that lives close to there starts trying to sell me on doing these other two cases in his department. And I was telling him about all the problems we're having with Asheville and how I just couldn't get a connection. And, they're being really vague about things and treating me like a reporter. And he was like, I don't want to throw his name out there, but he was like, if you want to investigate these cases, you can see everything. We'll bring you into the evidence room. It's like, I'll set you up with interviews with everyone. I promise they'll cooperate with you because we really want these cases to get that type of attention. And so that was kind of the interesting part, is that especially will lead us to do things in the future. But, and the other thing about my background is I think that I just look at things through a different lens than Brian because of my experience. And so while Brian may be looking at the historical sense of what was going on in Asheville during that time, I get super focused on what the crime scene looked like that day and what the police officers should have been doing at that time and what their
Yeah, there was a bit of a freeze, but
Oh, okay. I didn't know if that was me or what.
if you want to finish what you were saying about the last sentence you were saying.
Oh, I'm sorry. I guess I got cut off. So I think that what's really helps with my background and for us to have really polar opposite backgrounds with Brian's being in the academic world is that we just look at things completely differently. And some of the things that Brian would help out from being on kind of like that public side of research is I'd never done Freedom of Information Act request and those type of things because in law enforcement, I would just go into a database or I would just call the department that I needed the document from. Or with Raleigh, we had it's called the Raleigh Intelligence Center, where they've got a handful of detectives and some non-sworn personnel that do nothing but research for you. So, being not in a law enforcement role in this, that was a learning process for me of how are we going to get these documents
right
the same way that the public would.
Yeah. So I really want to thank you both for joining me on this podcast. If you have any final thoughts that you want to share with the audience before we close out.
Sure. I hope you will enjoy I hope your readers enjoy the book. If they like true crime and they like stories with lots of twists and rabbit holes you can go down, we have an abundant number of rabbit holes that we have carefully laid out for you, and we invite you to step into them and kind of join us in this in a discussion of this case. And we hope if you read this book that you'll reach out to us. We are always interested in new perspectives and ideas, and we included a lot of the documents that we found in the book, at least some of the major ones that we include those specifically so you can kind of jump into this with us, and that by the time you finish reading this book, just know you know more about this book than almost everyone in North Carolina right now, and you also know more about this case than even many members of the Kerr Nashville Police Department.
Wow. Any final?
Yeah, I'm going to piggyback off what he said. And that's one of the purposes of this book that we wanted to do, or one of the goals, was to give the reader as much information as possible. And that's why we felt so strongly about putting the search warrant, the medical examiner's report, a timeline. All of that is unredacted. The timeline is the best that we can, figure out and what's been reported. And we would love to hear people's point of view. And if they've got something else that they've heard, or they've got a tie to some of the people in this book, we would love for them to reach out to us. And again, you can reach out to us on X at Brian Santana, or you can reach out on X at Santana Brothers True Crime, or Instagram on Santana Brothers True Crime.
And just so the audience knows, those links will also be in the description of this podcast. So I want to thank you both for being on the show. And to conclude, if you wish for you or your book to be on the show, go to amysbookshelfreviews.com/podcast. Thank you for listening. Be safe and be well.
Thank you for listening to Amy's Bookshelf Reviews. If you are looking to be on the podcast or looking for a book review, you can go to amysbookshelfreviews.com and look for the appropriate navigational menu. Again, thank you all for listening and being a supporter of this podcast and of the Amy's Bookshelf Reviews professional reviewers of books and audiobooks. Thank you all. Be safe and be well.